Okay, thank you very much for having me to speak here today. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department. My research, my dissertation research was on looking at historical legacies in contemporary civil wars, ethnic conflict. This is a new project, sort of moving on. I still continue to work on that stuff. This is a new project that sort of starts looking at what happens after conflict ends. Okay, this is a rhetorical question. There is no new beginning. Part of what makes this an interesting line of research is that sort of it's really about how the past continues to shape present politics in these post-conflict zones. The question that I'm addressing in this particular talk is basically about whether does a history of civil war is it conducive to the emergence of authoritarian party systems? In other words, once a war ends, is it and party politics is established, elections are established. Do you see the emergence of authoritarian party systems? Okay, so I'll just move on from there. There is some literature on this. There is work that directly looks at this issue, civil wars and the development of authoritarian party systems. There's this work by John Ishiyama, and he argues that basically what happens is after civil war, incumbent parties have certain very obvious advantages in terms of political organization, okay, which sort of makes them more likely to sort of win in elections. There is a very interesting literature on how what happens to rebel groups who become political parties. There is this interesting work in economics on elections in the shadow of violence. And there's of course this work on Southeast Asia, authoritarian regimes in Southeast Asia. There is work by Stan Slater, Levitsky on how the specter of communism in the 1950s and 60s led to the creation of authoritarian governments in this part of the world. And then there's this huge literature on the timing of post-Civil War elections. And there are sort of proponents of early elections. There are some people who say, no, you should delay elections. Now, this literature suffers from some limitations. One of that is that has paid very little attention to the South Asian context. And the other thing is, in much of these studies, the approach that is taken is very much behavioral, in the sense that you don't really know much about attitudes, political attitudes, how voters perceive the stakes of elections. There are some exceptions. Here are a few studies here. This particular work by Hogland and Kovacs, I think is has a very interesting take on these issues. So I'm going to borrow a little bit on that. Now, so I'm just going to borrow this very simple diagram just to tell you my theory a little bit. This is from the Hogland and Kovacs piece. And so basically the point they try to make here is they call this the peace triangle. So they're saying that when war ends and you have a period of peace, the peace can be of various forms. Okay? And in order to understand the nature of peace that prevails, you'll have to think of it in terms of three categories: the issues, behavior, and attitudes. Okay, so for example, a situation of unresolved peace takes place when there is a peace agreement, but the issues around which the conflict revolved has not been solved. Okay, and the example they give is Israel and the sort of Israel-Palestine issue. Okay, now that's an example of unresolved peace. You could have a situation of restored peace and then contested peace. Now, a lot of the work, and then of course behavior. Behavior here refers to what the parties involved in the conflict are doing. Okay, so for example, in a situation of partial peace, the one that I want to talk about, in a situation of insecure peace, for example, conflict has ended, but there's a lot of criminal activity that goes on as a legacy of the conflict. Okay, now a lot of the earlier work that I talked about is really happening in these two zones. A lot of it is focused on issues and behavior. much less has been done in terms of political attitudes. Okay? How do voters perceive the stakes of elections? Okay? In particular, what I want to talk about today is the effect that fear as an emotion, the effect that fear can have in terms of giving incumbent parties advantages in the elections, in the post-Civil War elections. Okay? And the reason one should look at attitudes is behavior can change, issues can change, but attitudes, emotions can be much more durable. Okay? And that is where I'm coming from. So quickly moving on, the empirical context of this study is the state of West Bengal in eastern India. This state is useful for my research purposes because in one part of the state, there was a Maoist insurgency from 2005 to 2011, and it was completely sort of stamped out after 2014. Now, this is a map of all the areas in India which have experienced Maoist violence, and the state that I'm particularly looking at is West Bengal, right here. And within West Bengal, this is the map of West Bengal, and within West Bengal, these areas right here, in the southwestern part, these are also called Junglemahal. These are the conflict-affected areas which have experienced Maoist violence. There has been no violence since 2014. Okay, violence has effectively been ended. Okay, whereas in these other parts of India, violence continues. This is something I'm going to come to at the last slide. Okay, so what's the methodology? So in 2016, along with a team of researchers, Mohan Datta, and members of the India Election Studies team, one of whom is here, Tabriz Niazi. So what we did was we did a survey in West Bengal before the state assembly elections that year. Now this survey had two components. We started off by doing a statewide survey in three phases, or in three stages. Now this survey, the problem with this survey is that it underrepresented the conflict-affected constituencies were underrepresented in this survey. So what we did was we also did a separate survey only on the conflict-affected constituencies. Okay, and so this is basically the number of respondents we had. So we had 5,198 respondents in the areas that were not affected by a conflict, and 1,183 respondents in the areas that were affected by conflict. So CAC means conflict-affected constituencies, NCAC means constituencies not affected by conflict. Now, since then, I myself have done a follow-up survey, which just ended this last April, before the ongoing elections in India. So this survey, I did this survey, which basically it ended in April 2019. It's a follow-up to this, the earlier survey we did. And this survey was only concentrated in the conflict-affected constituencies, and there were 1,140 respondents. Okay. Now, I just wanted to point out that both of these surveys were funded by MOE Tier 1 grant. Okay, so one of the first, I'm just going to present some very basic statistics, 2 slides, so bear with me. The first thing, so all of this is based on the 2016 data. The first simple thing that I want to establish is that there's the generalized sense of insecurity is much higher in the conflict-affected districts compared to the non-conflict-affected districts. I'm just going to present some simple results from our survey. So in the survey, we had this battery of questions on this issue of insecurity. Okay, and basically we had these statements, and we asked our respondents to tell us how they felt about it. Like, so the first statement was that West Bengal is safe and secure. What do you feel about this on a scale of 1 to 5? Do you agree or you disagree? Do you strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and so on? So on a 5-point scale. Okay? And then, are you concerned about election violence? And stuff like that. Are you concerned about communal violence? These are these are basically the means of the responses for both the samples. Okay? And a simple comparison of the means. And what you see is, across all these questions, it's pretty clear that the general level of insecurity is much higher, systematically higher in the conflict-affected constituencies. And this last question here kind of summarizes all of it. So in this question, we asked respondents that, how important is it that a candidate comes to you and says and offers you security? How important is it on a scale of 1 to 5? How much do you value that? Okay, and again, what you see is that there's a systematically higher, in the conflict-affected constituencies, this is something that's really valued. The last thing that I want to present is this sort of an analysis of propensity to vote in the conflict-affected constituency. So what this tells us is that generalized insecurity is high in the conflict-affected constituencies. Now the question is, does this give some sort of a security dividend to the incumbent party, the ruling party? Okay, and that is what I try to address in this particular slide. Now there's a bunch of stuff here. I just want to quickly this is a regression analysis. And I just want to point out a couple of things. In any study of this sort, you need to control for some other factors. Security is not the only thing that matters. So here, this is where we control for voting in past elections. This is an important variable, party leader approval. How much do you approve the party leaders? Religion, education, caste is important in India, class, interest in campaigns, sex, number of aged people in the household, party contacts during campaigns, trust in local government. So these are all control variables. And then salience of issues. These were the salient issues in the election. Now the question is how, and basically the question then is, we want to understand how these affect your propensity to vote for the incumbent. Okay? So for example, if you have a lot of trust in the local government, how does that affect your propensity to vote for the incumbent? Now, one of the things that I want to point out is this is actually a very good regression model, because almost like 80% of the variation in the outcome variables are being explained by this model. Okay? Now, I want to draw your attention to the last variable here. How important is security in your vote? Okay? And this is a propensity to vote for the opposition party. And what you see here is a systematic, there's a systematic security dividend for the ruling party. Okay, it's pretty systematic. This is actually statistically significant at the 0.001 level. This one is actually also very close to conventional levels of significance. So what we see is that the incumbent is positively getting a security dividend. Okay, and the opposition is positively getting hurt because of this generalized feeling of insecurity. So moving forward, so basically this is the conclusion, that the incumbent party enjoyed a clear security dividend in the conflict-affected constituencies in these elections. One extension that I'm going to do after this is basically to see how, because I have the 2019 data, I can test how these attitudes have changed over time. In particular, one of the big things in India in the last 5 years is the rise of Narendra Modi. Okay, whether that has sort of attenuated some of these security considerations. And then moving forward, the goal is to take this research to other areas in India where the Maoist insurgency is ongoing. Okay, this research was in a place where the insurgency has ended. Now we want to move on to areas where it's still ongoing and see how that affects election and voting. And just to say, this is not just an India-specific project. I mean, this could apply, and in the Southeast Asian context, you have Mindanao, you have southern Thailand, all these places where you have had insurgencies and have experienced peace after that. This research applies to all of those places. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
I'm just curious about the language of the questionnaire. What word did you use for security?
The word we used is the word that's used in the Bengali language, which is Shurokka.
How does that translate? It doesn't translate to security though, right?
That's yeah.
Was it implications of bodily safety or environmental lack of violence, or do you know what I mean? I'm trying to say security is a very open-ended word.
So basically, yeah, so I guess that's a good question. So basically what you're saying is you may have
No, I'm not assuming anything. I'm just curious what the implicates. How does the word actually translate?
So I thought, I thought we used it in the very sort of, the sort of very commonplace, in a sense, a very commonplace use of the term, the sort of Bengali political discourse. But now that you say it, does it sort of, I mean, security could have multiple dimensions.
The English word has a lot of dimensions. I'm just curious how the Bengali word, what is the primary implication? Lack of physical violence on the body?
The lack of physical violence, yes, what you're getting at here. I mean, when we talk about security in the Bengali language, in the context of West Bengal, what you're talking today, these last 4 or 5 years, it's really about the lack of physical violence.
Would, for example, domestic violence also come under that that category?
Would domestic violence come
Meaning,
under
if
that
you ask a
category?
woman if she was feeling more secure, would she include what might be happening in her household under that label?
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't go that far. So we're really talking here about public forms